Well, Syria is not only embroiled in a civil war, it's also battling to save its economy. The country is coping with raging inflation, a plummeting currency, and devastated industrial and agricultural sectors. And joining me now is Dr. Samer Abboud, Assistant Professor of History at Arcadia University and an expert on Syria and Lebanon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So how is this war impacting the economy so far? Obviously, it has a devastating effect. To what extent has it devastated Syria?
Absolutely. Well, I think we can speak at this moment in the conflict, we can speak of Syria being fully a war economy at this point. The government is imposing war budgets on the country, and we see all of the kind of macro and micro effects of a war in the country. We've seen that evolve over time. So the situation 6 months into the conflict, a year into the conflict, was considerably different than it is now. What we're talking about at this point is a complete collapse of the macro and the micro economy in Syria.
And Dr. Abboud, oil is one of Syria's main exports, and that industry has been hit by sanctions and a disruption of supplies. But what about other exports? How have they been impacted?
Well, Syria, once the sanctions were imposed by the European Union, the United States, and the League of Arab States, this didn't have an immediate effect because many of the contracts that were signed were fulfilled. So it took oil production, or oil exports, sorry, about 6 months until they stopped in the European Union. The same could be said of textiles, manufacturing production. Those contracts that were in the mostly Arab Gulf states and in Turkey were fulfilled for the first few months after sanctions. What happened over time was that no new contracts were signed. So many of the industrialists that were producing in Syria, that were sending to Gulf states, picked up and moved to countries like Egypt, like Turkey, and in some cases to the Gulf. So you had a complete collapse of the export sectors.
Well, that is obviously not an environment that's conducive to good business, but what were some of Syria's most thriving sectors before the war?
Well, Syria, the government had realized rather reluctantly, probably about 10 or 15 years ago, that their dependence on oil production and exports to feed the budget wouldn't last much longer. And so they gradually started this process of marketization that was accelerated around the mid-2000s. And the strategic goal of marketization at that point was to shift the economy more towards services and, transportation, tourism, financial services. And there was a gradual marketization of the economy that tried to shift away from oil. And unfortunately, one of the shifts that occurred at that time as well was a shift away from agriculture, even though agriculture formed a core of the Syrian economy, both in terms of its contribution to gross domestic product, but also in terms of its labor market share.
Well, tourism, much like in Egypt, is always one of the first casualties of any kind of unrest. Which areas are there that companies could potentially still invest in? Is there any opportunity to make money in this kind of turmoil?
That's a very difficult question because of the way in which the country is de facto split. It's extremely difficult to get products, to get goods from one part of the country to the other. And as I said at the beginning, that this is a full war economy at this point. And so there's a tremendous amount of informality. In terms of what's actually happening in the economy, there's a reconstruction committee that the government has set up to basically address the immediate need that people have for essential services.
Right.
So a lot of engineering services, things of that nature, getting electricity back up, getting water, sanitation services, things of that nature. There's a desperate need for that and a desperate need for capital, investment, and expertise in those areas.
Well, President Bashar Assad's government has been receiving deep financial support from Iran and Russia. They're also supporting him militarily. So how has he been trying to keep the economy afloat? Where is he injecting these funds?
Well, what the government has done is reverted to its policies of a generation ago, which is to essentially marshal the budget and marshal its financial resources towards social stability, if you will. So they've re-injected the subsidies program. They've placed considerable controls that haven't been successful on capital flight. They have taken measures to prevent dollarization within the economy. And what they've tried to do is to use their financial resources to prop up local markets, if you will, the more micro markets, to subsidize fuel, gas, heat, to reintroduce subsidies on basic foods, so that the bigger impact, if you will, from the macroeconomy is mitigated by the time that it reaches households.
And of course, the Syrian pound is now trading at about 300 to the dollar, totally decimated. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Samer Abboud, Assistant Professor of History at Arcadia University.